course, you're here for a very specific event this evening. We are joined by Molly Beer, a nonfiction author who is here to discuss her new book, Angelica, Love and Country in a Time of Revolution, which explores the American Revolution and the U.S. founding era through the far-flung life and political friendships of Angelica Schuyler Church. So with that, please join me in welcoming Molly Beer.
Ann Arbor District Library for everything you do and for having me here tonight to talk about my friend Angelica. How's my mic working? Yeah, I'm okay? Thank you. I can't tell. So I'm going to talk about Angelica, who's the subject of this book, but I want to talk more generally about writing women in history, about writing about women in history and writing women into history. I'm going to talk about her as the example that I've been using because she's such an egregiously missing figure in our discussion of American history, along with so many other women who were participants in the American Revolution. But I picked her, and I'll tell you why. Because I grew up in the town of Angelica, New York, and it was founded by Angelica Church and her family, and it's this rural town. It's designed after Paris with an arrondissement in the middle, and I rode the Angelica school bus to school to go to the Angelica Central School, and afterwards I went home I walked to the Angelica Free Library to spend my afternoons with books. And so I grew up with a female founder, and I grew up with American history being something that connected very directly to a woman, and then I learned it through a woman. I didn't learn Alexander Hamilton first. I learned about Angelica, and then by extension from her, I learned about him. Thomas Jefferson, a friend of Angelica. George Washington, obviously I did get him, but Cherry Tree's also Angelica. So I just had this female lens on American history that made it come alive to me and made it feel relevant to me and made me feel like, as a girl growing up in a pretty hardscrabble place, that I still had a place in the country's history and thus a space in its future. And so I didn't know this was unique until I left home and got out in the world and realized that people didn't know who Angelica was or that she existed, or that women in history were doing more than like darning socks, and that sort of made me sad. And so I thought I would write this book to fill in that gap for more American girls and American women who might like to see themselves in the history and thus have a stake in the country and potentially its future. So let me tell you about this process of writing this woman as a historical figure. And this will be, for those of you who aren't sharp on your Revolutionary War history, I'm going to do you a solid and help you get ready for the 250th birthday next year, so we can do a little refreshing. And so this is her life, and then after I sort of run through this story of women in history, my colleague is going to come up and we're going to have a discussion, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. So that's what you have in store for you this evening. So here's where we start. Not that slide, that slide. So here's the thing about writing about women, and that is their names change all the time. And it's complicated because, they change people when they change names. So Angelica doesn't even start as Angelica. She starts out as Angelica Schuyler in Albany in the Royal Colony of New York, which is formerly Beverwyck of the Colony of New Netherland. So she is a child of a Dutch family. Her hearth language, her first language is Dutch in these remote areas. And even though it is a British colony and has been for a century, that hasn't really made it into New York to the same degree as it has elsewhere. So, and this is a view looking upriver. Albany is on the left, and That's her grandfather's house on the right, sort of jutting out over the river. And it's painted by a woman who was a friend of Angelica's a little bit later. So that's what her world looked like. You've got windmills, you've got cleared hills, but you're basically 5 days sail upriver from New York, and that's 6 weeks, if you're lucky, 2 months or worse from England. But what she does have are strong women around her. This on the left, Elizabeth Stotts Wendell Schuyler, is in fact her father's grandmother. And you see she's pictured with a book, which I think is important to point out, that this isn't novel, that you have women who are educated. Now, what's really novel about her having a book is that Elizabeth Schuyler had 9 children with her first husband, who had 2 children previously, and then 3 more children with her second husband. So she has 15 children and reads a book, which I think is amazing. In the middle, we have Katharina van Rensselaer Schuyler. This is Engeltje's mother. And she's a direct descendant of the Van Rensselaer family, who were the first patroons of Albany. So when the Netherlands decided they were going to start a colony, they sort of broke it up into chunks, and they got people to sign up to have one of those chunks of land, and then they would develop it and settle it and pay to sort of get things off the ground. And that was Katarina's, I think it's 9 generations, so it must be 8 generations for Katarina, her grandfather, who never came from Amsterdam, but did send ships and supplies. And so she is still considered, a leader of the community. And on the right is Margaretha Livingston. And the Livingstons, although their name does not sound Dutch, are in fact associated with the Dutch families of New York because they came via the Netherlands. A lot of, Puritans and Protestants who had gone to the Netherlands from England a generation back, before the first settlers came. But at this point, there have been many generations of Livingstons. And Engeltje is named after her maternal grandmother, who is a Livingston, and she grows up with the Livingstons. Now, Margarita is the mother of Robert R. Livingston, who was one of the members of the committee who drafted the Declaration of Independence. And her daughter, Janet Livingston, was married to Robert Montgomery, who was killed in one of the first big battles. He was one of the first prominent men who were killed in the Revolution at the Battle of Quebec. And so Janet becomes a martyr's widow, and she's a very public figure through the Revolutionary War. So these are 3 women who are who are indicative of the female power around Engeltje when she's born. Now, one thing that I'm careful to do in writing her story is try to feel out what the world of women is and identify what it is they're doing. So we're going to talk about food, of course, because this interests me way more than military history. It's just a matter of taste. And so this is, so my research in looking at women's lives, looking at Dutch cookbooks from this time period. And so just to give you a sample, stewed eels with herbs. Split the eel open, wash it clean, take sorrel, chervil, and parsley, some rice, a little mace, tied to clothes, boiled in water, some salt in it, and when the eel floats, take it out and place it on an earthenware colander, and a sauce of butter and vinegar with an egg is poured over it, is good. I mean, meals are important. You have to get them right. They're important to politics. All right. The other thing that's going on in Engeltje's childhood is the French and Indian War takes place, and during the French and Indian War, the British were quartering officers and soldiers in the homes that were previously Dutch-speaking homes. So suddenly you have Englishmen living in your second best bed, 1 or 2 or 3 of them. And so the house on the left is the Schuyler house prior to the French and Indian War. And the house on the right is the house that Katarina van Rensselaer built while her husband was in England buying the wallpaper. And it's an English-style home. And so they are trying to assimilate into British society at this point, and the house is indicative of that. And this is a public museum in Albany, and they still have it set up as a Schuyler mansion, and you can go in and they have the furniture, and they'll tell you the stories of the people who were there. And I love visiting houses because monuments and paintings and so forth are fairly subjective, but the houses are still the cellular matter that existed then, and so they can be used to house and tell multiple stories. So yes, this is General Schuyler's house. It was a military headquarters through the Revolutionary War, but it's also a space where women were cooking and enslaved people were working and children were growing up, and and all these other lives are happening around that, and the space is still available to tell those larger stories. So the other role for women is educating their children, then, now, etc. Angelica and Angelica and her sisters were very well educated. Initially, they're educated by an aunt in Albany who takes girls into her home and teaches them things like how to have a successful dinner party for people who come through your house. Houses were not, especially houses like the one I showed you, are not private spaces. There are no hotels, If people are coming through, they come and stay at your house for a few weeks. If they have the right letter of recommendation, or letter of reference, letter of recommendation to come, be your guest. So a hostess isn't just, a one-off scenario. It's often extended. You are going to have, military and political figures coming through your house if you are one of these prominent women like Angelica. And so one of the things that her great aunt emphasized was that women needed to set aside a few hours every day in which to read intelligent material so that they would be prepared to run a conversation at those dinners that would be, enlightened, elevated, intellectual, and so forth. And so she was educated in Albany to the extent that they felt they could do, but they wanted her to learn more. She and her younger sister Elizabeth, the future Elizabeth Hamilton, are sent to boarding school in Manhattan, and they attend Anne Rogers School. And this is an advertisement from the newspaper. And I just have these clips to show you the sort of research I'm compiling, because there is a tradition in history writing to fictionalize women. And so a lot of the material that exists, in written work is a little loose on the facts with women. And it's easy to assume that the documents don't exist, that the records don't exist. But for elite, prominent women like Angelica, they do. I mean, here is the newspaper advertising her school, and I know she goes to, in the letters, it's Madame Rougy's boarding school, and then I figured out, Rougy is Roger, but they're saying it in French. And then letters between the family who live in Manhattan, who take care of the girls while they're there and keep an eye on things. Because they're 6 and 7 when they go 5 days voyage downriver, because that's how important learning French was to their family for these girls. Then there was a little bit of trouble called the Stamp Act riots, and the girls went home to Albany, where they attended a school in Albany that they described as designed simply to keep them busy. So another facet of women's lives at the time, pre-revolution, in Albany, is enslavement. And if we're telling history, we got to tell the whole history. So in colonial New York, all of the colonies prior to the Revolution, slavery is legal and practiced. In New York specifically, and in the Dutch families, slavery is not it's not plantation slavery like in the South. It's very domestic. The families are, that house contains multiple families living in it. Some of them are indentured, some of them are enslaved, some of them are hired help, and some of them are relatives and friends and visitors and so on. It's a very crowded space. But to give a sense of what the system of slavery was in New York at this time, there's this painting which is at the Met, and 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 an important piece of artwork as we're revisiting this history, to be able to see, how that contemporary representation, to sort of get a sense of what it looked like, but also stories from the time, what the families would do, and how deeply embedded enslavement was in the families. Is they would have a ceremony for the children, matching them with an enslaved child. So as very young children, a master child and an enslaved child were joined. In the ceremony, the master child would give the enslaved child a pair of shoes as a symbol of that bondage of relationship. And then they would be raised together in the family, being taught how to behave vis-a-vis one another. So for Angelica, and I have no records that she was ever matched with a child. And it may, don't assume because this looks like a dress that this is a girl. Boys aren't breeched until they're, really able to handle it. Until then, they're wearing gowns. So I don't have a record that she specifically was matched this way, but I think it's likely. And so that she was raised from childhood, from pre-memory to this relationship. Okay, broader context, get outside the house. Now, we tend to think of women's lives and histories as being this steady trajectory wherein we become more and more liberated, decade by decade, century by century, and sure, but also, there's the pendulum. It moves forward and it swings back, and it moves forward and it swings back. And so in Angelica's time, when she's a kid, there are heads of state who are women. This is Empress Catherine of Russia, who will become Catherine the Great, and the Archduchess Maria Theresa, who's head of state for 40 years after the Austrian War of Succession. And they're very prominent leaders, and they're very powerful women, heads of state. And so that's, not just is your mother in charge of your household, and, your father will leave for 2 years after he's been gone at war, and you live in this space that's all women, but you also have in your larger awareness of the world that there are women who run countries and who run businesses and who run, So, and of course, Maria Theresa is the mother of Marie Antoinette, who is the exact same age as Angelica for some from space, and who will also, because of course they all, got told they looked like a man, that they weren't feminine, or that they were, too feminine, or whatever. I think Marie Antoinette was Maria Theresa's 11th child. Okay, so that's the larger context. When the Stamp Act riots take place, and the conflict becomes, gets into the slide towards the revolution. In New York, there are riots after the Stamp Act. Thomas Gage, who's married to a Dutch New Yorker, becomes commander-in-chief of New York, later of all the British forces. But he's someone that Angelica knows informally as a family member. I'm skipping a spot. Right. So the Stamp Act riots happen. You have this conflicts up state are happening simultaneously, and a new governor comes to New York to help quell the uprisings. And he comes to Albany and stays with the Schuylers for several weeks. They're going to find the border between Canada and New York, since the French and Indian War had changed the borders. And so they're going to do that. And in the meantime, the women stay together. And so I want to read to you a little bit about those women. So it's not just Angelica's mother, but the governor's wife. And so the Moors have just arrived from Jamaica, and they're supposed to, keep this fractious colony from exploding. And so this is just a taste, what the book sounds like and what kind of language we're using. The book looks only forward. It's not a history where we're and what it all means is, and it's not thesis driven. It really is her life as it unfolds. The Moores remained with the Schuylers for a full month, first in Albany and then at the farm in Saratoga that had become the Schuylers' principal interest. Here, Philip Schuyler showed off his mills and his crops and then led the governors and surveyors north to set the border. Once the men were gone, the ladies abandoned city dress for simple linen negligees and high caps and formal dinners for casual picnics on the river that at Saratoga was more like a good-sized creek. Lady Catherine Moore, formerly Catherine Maria Long of Longville, Jamaica, and Catherine Schuyler, formerly Katharina van Rensselaer, descendant of the patroons of Rensselaerwyck, were both colonists raised on the edge of empire. Both had experienced war, and both had buried children. Both were leaders, living as examples always on public display. Both were accustomed to status, to its privileges and responsibilities, and to the effort that came with maintaining that status. Perhaps Lady Catherine Moore and Katerina Schuyler discussed these commonalities and their corresponding challenges. Perhaps they did not need to do so. What two mothers sharing a household over several weeks could not help but discuss were their children. Lady Moore's adolescent daughter, Susanna, was a very beautiful girl with, quote, apparently no dislike to be seen, end quote, which was worrisome for her mother, mainly because the governor's mansion was located inside a military fort, where Susanna could enjoy being looked at by entire regiments. Katerina Schuyler's three living daughters, Angelica, Elizabeth, and Margarita, had not yet crossed into puberty, but at 10, just 9, and almost 8, their rivalries must have been incessant. As for their sons, where Katerina's daughters were healthy and vigorous, her third son, to be named John Bradstreet, was the first to reach his first birthday. Lady Catherine also had a son, Angelica's age, who loved poetry. But as the English believed boys, like horses, ought to be separated from their mothers early, lest they turn soft or sour, her boy, John Henry, had been sent over to England to attend Eton College, and it would be years before she could hope to see him again. At some point in their conversation, as they rambled with the children through the rugged landscape that grew more dramatic as autumn advanced, Lady Catherine decided to invite Angelica Schuyler to live with them in the governor's mansion in New York for the winter. This idea was at once entirely practical and politically significant. Mothers to mother, it was a simple fix. Removing Angelica from her siblings would reduce the squabbling. And providing a little sister for Susanna would bring her more of the attention she craved and help her stay a little girl just a little longer. But both women were adept at tending the web of connections, of friendships, alliance, and bloodlines. When New York saw Katerina's daughter, they would know what good, close friends the Moores had in Albany. As for the Schuylers, Angelica residing with the Moores would represent her family, Albany, and even Dutch New York, like a little ambassador in the royal governor's court. She would be olive branch and wampum belt, and perhaps her tiny presence and what it symbolized could in some small way help keep peace along the North River. The Dutch don't call it Hudson's River. Now, just as they had prepared to receive the Moores, the members of the pastor's household scrambled to prepare Angelica to leave with them. Her trunk was packed with her whitest linens, prettiest ribbons, and, for the coming winter, stockings, quilted petticoats, perhaps a fur-lined cape. Meanwhile, the little girl was crammed with the typical admonishments given to children who will be out in public. She must behave herself, obey her hosts, use her best manners, wash her face, and keep tidy. And since Angelica was a New Netherlander child entering an English household, even if Sir Harry did speak Dutch, she must speak English, even for her name. When she boarded the royal governor's sloop for New York, she became Angelica. So this is New York, right before, hell breaks loose. That's Fort George. It's on the tip of Manhattan Island. I think I have, my next slide's going to show that location. Nope. There we go. So that's the fort. It's right at the tip of Manhattan, which is sort of doubled in size at this point past Wall Street. So Wall Street's sort of the middle of that settled area on that map that was made during the Moore administration. It was probably a fun place to live. There were tunnels out through into the town. There's the ramparts, there are all the redcoats to watch and so on. And then, here are letters from the royal governor talking about her specifically. And this is what I had a lot of reading to do, what I had to read. And of course, it's not sorted and it's not linked to the names of women. It's only the men. Miss Schuyler desires I should inform you that she's extremely shocked that you make no mention of sending your duty to her. Now, she's not writing letters yet, and her mother doesn't write letters. Girls are educated to read, but they aren't given pens. They're given needles. So those samplers, right? So girls would learn to sew their letters, but not necessarily to use a pen. And people were really convinced that girls were not capable of having nice handwriting like men who had really beautiful handwriting. My children don't believe me. My sons don't believe me that this is true. All right. We're going to skip forward. The war breaks out, 1775. In the meantime, Philip Schuyler's relationship with the Moors is so concreted by Angelica staying with the family, and that family tie is so strong that he winds up getting involved in New York politics. And by the time the War for Independence breaks out, he's in the Continental Congress. So his political career has taken off thanks to his daughter, and he's in that position. So when war is declared and George Washington is made commander-in-chief, there are 4 major generals appointed under him, and Philip Schuyler, Angelica's father, is one of them. And he's in command of the Northern Department of New York, which may seem like it's the middle of nowhere, but when water is your means of transportation, Hudson River, or the North River, as the Dutch call it, goes by all 3 at this time, is navigable to Albany, and then there's a portage, and after that you can reach Lake George and then Lake Champlain, which flow north into the St. Lawrence Seaway at Montreal and Quebec. So that whole channel is a very valuable political, strategic area. And in fact, the invasion of Canada is that takes place the first year of the war, is supposed to be led by Philip Schuyler. So what is Angelica doing? So this is the history we hear, right? The war breaks out, shots fired, Lexington and Concord, George Washington rides in, he's going to be a near-year general. So we have those, but the generals are on the road, and everything else is getting managed by even their daughter. So this is July 4, 1776, and here's the first letter I have written by Angelica herself. And it's to her father. And it's a report of what's, the news they're getting at Albany. He's out in the forts. There are several forts on the Mohawk River, and Fort Ticonderoga people have heard of as on Champlain. Time passes very heavily here. We hear no news of the army at Illinois, and the idea of a ministerial fleet is lost in our disgust of American perfidy. The fleet were to have attacked the city on the day on which the conspirators were to have assassinated our worthy generals. So she's, 20, and she's writing about political news to her father, who is one of the top 4 generals of the Revolutionary War. And in the meantime, their house is a full-on military headquarters with people who are coming up, traveling through to see, and this includes Benjamin Franklin, who's going to go to Quebec after the Battle of Quebec, to see if they can negotiate something not with a battle, and that fails, but he spends time with the Schuylers and rolling through. So they have a lot of house guests. They have people who are sick and injured who are staying in the house, and she's writing these letters. Her mother doesn't write letters. But that doesn't last very long, because a year later, she runs away and elopes with this man named John Carter. He had blue eyes. He had nothing else to commend him, really. Her parents were furious. He's a Treasury commissioner. He's come up to audit the army. New Englanders aren't thrilled with the Dutchman leading part of the Continental Army. But they sneak out, they go across the river, they go to Massachusetts, where it's easier to get married. They get married, they come back, they tell their parents. Now, since her father had just lost Fort Ticonderoga to the British the same week, it was a rough time for him. And her mother was furious and would probably, and I don't think ever really fully forgave Angelica for eloping. But it's a new life for her. So I'm going to go quickly through here. I hope you read the book. But I will say that if your Revolutionary War history, is still in there, she's at Saratoga, she's at Boston, she's at Newport, she's at White Plains, she's at Philadelphia. She's even at Yorktown. Once she gets married and leaves home, her husband gets a job as the supplier to the French army under General Rochambeau. And so she, spends a great deal of time with that army, working as sort of a liaison, helping prevent culture clash from breaking the alliance that Benjamin Franklin has negotiated, this Treaty of Amity, and that's great. The French come, the Americans really need the help. But the French and Indian War is fresh in everybody's memory. There was a lot of propaganda. The French eat babies. They're also Catholic in New England. It was really rough. But she helped out with important things like teaching the French not to kiss men in the streets, and other important cultural situations that could escalate into larger problems. So this is the French and the American armies after the Battle of Yorktown, which they collaborated on. And this painting she actually helped the making of because she knew all the officers, and she went to France with John Trumbull later on when he was taking their portraits to make the painting. So not only was she not present at Yorktown proper during the battle because she had a baby that week, but soon after and in some of the fallout that was pretty instrumental in solidifying the gains of the battle, because peace doesn't happen on the battle. The Battle of Yorktown was in 1781. The war wasn't over until 1783. So we all think of the Battle of Yorktown, that ended the war. But of course, if you were there, you don't know that's the end of the war. You don't know when the battle that ended things happened, when that battle happens. But in 1783, when the war ends, she goes to Paris. And that's where the treaty ending the war is signed. And so there's a lot of celebration there. All her friends from the army are there. Their balloons are taking off. Marie Antoinette is getting in all kinds of trouble because she had her portrait made in her underwear on the left. And France was so scandalized they had to repaint her portrait in French silk properly. But I also like to think that Marie Antoinette is channeling these American women that she's been reading about in the books from the officers who returned from fighting in the war, and they've been talking about this simple, pure life that people are living. So I have this idea that that's Marie Antoinette dressed up as Angelica. Okay, so she's in France for 6-8 months. She has another baby there. That's her. She has a child while she's in Paris, and then, while she's there, her father makes a trip to England, where he, is from, and he makes nice with his family, pays some debts that were outstanding with the money he's made supplying the French. And when he comes back to France, he's like, guess what? I've made up with my family, and I've taken my real name. He's been using a nom de guerre, and her name changes again, and now she's Angelica Church. And other news, he found a house for her in England. So after fighting a war against England to be independent of it, she then gets to move there. And they're there for a long time. They're there until 1797. Her husband is in Parliament. He tries to run for the seat for Windsor, but the king gets really mad about that since he fought in the Revolution against Britain. While he's doing that, Angelica is living, she's never thought of as an English woman, even though her husband is English. She's always thought of as the general's daughter, as an American woman. So she's very prominent that way. And she's representing the U.S. as in peacetime. And so in terms of how she does that and what statement she's trying to make, I have these paintings. So there's the portrait on the top of Marie Antoinette and below of Angelica. Painted by John Trumbull, who's her friend forever, but it's done in England, and the paintings are remarkably similar, right down to the stripes on the headpiece and the ribbons and the feathers and so on, and even the posture of her arm and the angle. Now, if you think that's a stretch, then take a look at the painting of her son that John Trumbull also made, and compare it to this painting of Prince Octavius, who had just died of his smallpox vaccination or inoculation. But you can see from the red curtains to the outfit, and then to the distinctions where the prince is wearing his ceremonial sword, and Philip Church, Angelica's firstborn son, is holding a musket. And then there's the Yankee Doodle hat, and then the king's, his hat. So she's doing these what does a prominent American look like, and so forth, while she's there. The other thing that happens while she's hanging out with artists, this is Maria Hadfield in the middle, is she becomes friends with Thomas Jefferson. She actually spends a winter in Paris, the year they're all talking about the new Constitution, and spends time with him. And then the French Revolution has out. This is a chart of the officers from the American War who got involved, who she and other women were helping to get out of France during the Terror, and then she's back in in the United States. She's still putting herself in the middle of these conflicts, such as this conflict. Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, who are political nemesis. I gotta look that up. And both are convinced that the other one is going to ruin the country. And yet both of them write to Angelica, and both of them, seek her opinions and enjoy her company, and feel very close to her. So she's putting herself in that space. She's still reporting on current events. Bonaparte dips his hands in blood during, as Bonaparte takes over France, which obviously she's very interested in. Jerome Bonaparte, his younger brother, who doesn't spell his name the French way, is unpleasantly situated, his marriage not approved, and his exile certain. He has been very imprudent with his conversation lately. I have heard from Paris that I had given him a fete. Talleyrand called on Madame de Cornay with his excuses for not doing what we wished him to do. That's Prince Talleyrand, with whom her cousin Robert Livingston negotiates the Louisiana Purchase. So she's still up in everybody's business. And then there's the dueling. And those guns belong to John Church. And they're the ones that were used in Philip Hamilton's duel and Alexander Hamilton's duel. And another duel that John Church, her husband, fought with Aaron Burr also. But nobody was hurt. And afterwards, just to prove to New York that everything was okay, Angelica brought him as his guest to a party. Even though they're opposite political parties and so on. And then she ends up in my town. After the Louisiana Purchase goes through and there's westward expansion gets underway, and she is up on the next movement. Anyway, so that's the book, and I'm gone over long, but I'm now going to call up my colleague, Jamie Delp, who is also a nonfiction writer. She holds an MFA from the University of Michigan in poetry, but she's also the director of this amazing program called the Great Lakes Writers Corps, which is a documentary nonfiction program that takes place at Michigan. It teaches students how to write and research nonfiction stories, and then sends them into Great Lakes communities to learn those stories, and then they come back and work with Jamie to write these amazing narratives about Michigan. So, on that note, if you would please. You can get me back on women, because I got a little derailed by this story. I told them, you're going to have to wave at me, because I've been living with Angelica so long. I just go on and on and on and on.
It's no, thank you so much for having me to do this discussion with you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Ann Arbor District Library. I'm so happy to get you back talking about women. So. I suppose I would start by sharing that you and I got a chance to really chat about the book before I had an opportunity to really dig into it. And one of the things that you had shared that really fascinated me, particularly as someone who didn't know very much at all about Angelica before speaking with you and then reading your book, was I'd asked you sort of where did you get the idea for the book? When did you know that you had a book? and you'd shared with me a little bit about, among other things, sort of writing in the back of this little antique store, which is a beautiful story. But one of the things that you'd mentioned was having questions yourself about, okay, really, who was Angelica? What, the kinds of questions that people might ask, like, what did she do? And you had shared that in order to write this book, you'd really had to reimagine or change the rubric because of the role that women played. And I wondered if you might talk a little bit more about how you changed that rubric and how this book came out of that idea.
Yeah, absolutely. So, there is a shape that we're used to seeing stories about the American Revolution. Like there is a, we've learned them for so long, and they become our creation myth for the country. So they're not just stories, and they're not just history. They've like evolved into something bigger and more intractable than that. The question people would say is like, well, what did she do? That was important. But what you can do that's important if you're an American woman, because there are biographies about lots of women from, Marie Antoinette and Catherine the Great and women who are in monarchical systems and thus great by blood. But outside of that, you have to be, a political figure. You have to be a soldier. You have to be, you have to sign a particular document, or you need to be, very successful in industry in some way. And none of those avenues are open to women, like that. None of those, like, and that. But that's not how you go into museums and graveyards, and it's all beloved mother sister. Like all the women are there. The museums are full of women, and you're like, how? Like they can't possibly have just been like back in the kitchen, like hiding under the table, all that time. And so you have this impression that they're there, but what is it that they were striving to do? What was it that they were devoting their lives to? What was it that they were, what? And, I just had to look for those things. And for Angelica and a lot of the women like her, and this is part of that tradition, I talked about her going into the governor's mansion, is that women have often taken the role of being embodying the alliance, right? Marie Antoinette is the daughter of the Archduchess of Austria. She marries the Dauphin of France. That's a political marriage. She's never met the guy, this is, and her life is now committed to embodying that space between those two countries. And Angelica, throughout her life, does actions like that. She goes into the governor's house. She, she takes Aaron Burr to the party as her guest. She is the person who's between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. So finding those things that women are doing that's so critical, and then being like, you have to rewrite the basic story a little bit to find that.
How much of her story had you been aware of before you really started digging into the research, before you were really doing the archival research and finding these letters and, having grown up where you grew up and having had, realized that was an untraditional way of understanding history through these strong female stories. I'm curious, were there moments when you were doing the research where you really thought, wow, I can't believe that I found this, or I can't believe the way that this tracks, or...
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, I knew a lot about her from sort of oral history in my community, because people remembered the family, and it's also a small town where we gossip about people who've been dead for 200 years, like they're in the next room. Some of you all know those towns. And so she was very alive in that way, and it really is a small town. It's still the same size it was when the Church family lived there, so it hasn't changed much at all. So I knew these things, and I didn't know this. If you've come at Angelica through history books, where she is, she wrote a lot of letters to a lot of people who were very important. Like the historians have not ignored her, but they have sort of interpreted her as well, how on earth could she have this much influence? Who is she sleeping with? That quick answer. and so, she comes in as a love interest in those in lots of historical works, like just to explain the influence that she and all of the network of friends that she had, and and that's not new or novel or going away or.
Or even remotely surprising.
Yeah, but I did. I mean, so I didn't know what I'd find. I didn't know if I'd like her. I didn't. If I really like dug through the records, people were like respected her in my community. But she, there's some elitism to that, like that she was such a prominent person. But yeah, no, I was just amazed. I didn't know if I would find a pattern. I didn't know if there was something she'd done that was relevant. And then, so when I did find this like pattern of behavior that she has of putting herself between adversaries, living in England as the American, that I was like, okay, she has something. Like I found it, but I didn't know what to look for.
I really appreciated seeing the photographs too. To that end, when you're showing the photo of the ways in which she, the way that she altered their home, and just imagining her hosting those dinner parties and caring for all of the military that was coming through, and sort of learning how to place herself in that role, essentially using her social power to place herself in these peacemaking roles. And it was really interesting to see that, and then notice the ways that you were laying the groundwork for that really early in the biography. Can I read a little
please.
section that I really loved? Hang on 1 second. This is actually shortly after the passage that you read. It's in chapter 4. It's tiny, but I really loved the way that that you were beginning to craft what we would come to see as this trend, her role. And this is when she's living with the Moors. As a girl, she would never have the option of wielding a sword. Even grasping a pen would require some audacity. A dinner table, she was learning, was as much a chessboard as any battlefield. One could cut meat either place, but it was reason, not cannons, that distinguished humans from beasts. So I really loved seeing the image and imagining where that all began for her. And then throughout, seeing these different ways in which she embodies that and really does bring peace.
Yeah, I mean, we spend a lot of time talking about the people who make war and not a lot of time talking about the people who end them, but they're just as important to the process.
I am going to jump in really quickly. Just because we're approaching the end of the hour, I want to make sure that we have time for Q&A. We can do that. And so I'll just really quickly ask if anyone has any questions that they want to ask to Molly or to Jamie, our panelists. And if we don't have questions, I'll let you get back to the conversation. But I just wanted to see if anyone had anything they wanted to ask or comment on.
Fascinating presentation. Thank you both. I'm starting to do archival research on my own family, and a lot of Dutch and French Huguenot. I'm curious about your journey into the archives. Where did you find the material? Was it hard to hunt up?
So, are you researching like a whole like tree of people, or are you looking at specific individuals?
A tree, but it's narrowed down to 2 people in particular that
Okay.
I'm fascinated with, yeah.
That's a good start. Otherwise, you can really bury yourself in. So, I mean, the archives are amazing. I had one in Delaware at the DuPont. The Hagley Library is an archives on the DuPonts on the Brandywine, where you have the later DuPont chemical, but early on, the gunpowder factories. And they have a magnificent library, and I was going through folders there, and like Josephine DuPont, who lived in Angelica after, who was one of the emigres who like wound up in Angelica as a friend of Angelica's. And her big fat braid of her hair fell out of the file folder in the archives. I shrieked in the quiet library, but they're hard to find, but they're, if you can find the library that has them or the once they're there, the boxes roll out, and it's incredible what people have stored and the work that libraries have done to keep this alive so that we can come and reinterpret it and see these other stories in the primary sources. In terms of, there's like the Tarrytown archives, like there's, each of the houses of each of the state house, the Claremont, and of course the state archives in Albany and so forth. Like there's a ton of material, and it's just an adventure. It was so fun to do, and what was surprising was not the difficulty. It was the vast quantity. It was my editors had to rein me in a lot. Yeah, no, but it's fun. It's like doing a puzzle without the picture, right? Like, you're like, I don't know what it is yet, but I have a million pieces that you can find, and then you're like, oh, just figure out what shape it makes.
Were you able to get a sense of some of the policy that she impacted? I'm thinking about, Abigail Adams sending a letter to her husband saying, remember the ladies. And I'm also thinking about the books that Cokie Roberts wrote. And when she talked about, the one in Capitol Dames, where the women were going to the Capitol and listening to the debate on the floor, and then talking about it among themselves and with their husbands. So, that using their social power continued after the Revolution. And I just wondered if, say, for example, the letters between her and Jefferson and Hamilton, if you got a sense of where she was in terms of
policies,
a seat in the room kind of thing or whatever.
Yeah, so she's subtle. I mean, she's certainly been trained in in subtlety. She's known as a woman in England with democratical values. There's a wonderful letter from this doctor who goes to try to break Lafayette out of jail in Austria, probably bankrolled by the Church family. She certainly supported the French Revolution at the onset. She supported Lafayette, so it's always a little difficult with her whether she's supporting the person or the policy. Thomas Jefferson wrote to her specifically about how women, the tender breasts of women were not cut out for politics. It's not start out right and sideways. And then her response to that is to send him a copy of the Federalist Papers that Elizabeth had sent to her. So she's not sort of like, let me pronounce on my policy, but she's like, here, why don't you read this book? She sent Adam Smith Wealth of Nations to Alexander Hamilton when he was, becoming Secretary of the Treasury. So she was sort of channeling people, but she's more of a networker than, a policy person. She would, when John Jay went to England to negotiate the Jay Treaty, his son writes that they at the churches 15 times in a month or whatever, and she would have those dinner parties where American politicians could meet with parliamentarians and discuss things sort of in that private space before, attempting to do it in public. So Charles James Fox, who's the Whig parliamentarian, would be at her dinners, and Gouverneur Morris, who's later becomes the ambassador to France, would come, likewise, and they could discuss issues at her home. But she would provide that space for it and structure those meetings. She had one party at her home. It's the Prince of Wales and his secret wife and the Duke of Orleans, and and she would have them she created this space for those conversations to take place, in as much as deciding saying explicitly what those policies should be.
If you wanted to share, I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I'm also from New York, and I'm so glad you brought something from New York to light that isn't just from the metropolitan area where I grew up. I grew up just outside the city, although I've lived in Ann Arbor for 28 years. I really like your approach that you're making this, world history, a very local issue with women, through women. Mm-hmm. I think it would be a great project to have, because I used to teach women's studies as a graduate student at U of M. many years ago. And I actually proposed this with the professor, but she laughed at it at the time, that maybe we could ask each student, whether they're from Michigan or wherever they're from, to look into the history of one woman, one prominent woman from their town, because even if it's a small town, there must be somebody, a woman that played a role in the history of the town, whether it's a big town or a small town. So I thought the approach was really fabulous, really novel. And it's a really interesting way, definitely a feminist approach, whether you intended for that or not. I think it's very innovative, and it's a really new take on historical approach too. I really commend you for that. It's really, and now I'm really tempted to go to Angelica, I saw on the map, that's what I was looking at my phone. It's on the west side of the state. I'm on the southeast, and it's the southwest.
Yeah. Oh, but we have a highway exit. That's
I'm sure,
we do. It's a big claim to fame. Thank you. So, I mean, one thing I was really cautious with this story is to, I love reading about women in history, but a lot of times to get those books published or to get them out into the world, I feel like there's pressure to tell them, to be like, well, she's a woman, but, it's like the people who are like, I have a cat, you don't like cats, but that's okay. My cat's really like a dog. And so, there are so many amazing women who, do manly things and succeed in men's world at things men are traditionally known for. And that's amazing. But we can also expand the rubric, to acknowledge the labor and the participation of more people. And obviously one elite woman is not the extent of the people who need to be acknowledged, but bringing those stories in and expanding the national story click by click by click, I think we got a bigger, more robust, more inclusive, I'm not going to use that word. I'm going to say less exclusive story of our history and that hopefully going forward. And so, yeah, I mean, it was definitely intentional. I wanted to tell her story in a way that would appeal to women across the political spectrum. I'm starting to do a lot of media work, with conservative outlets just to try to expand the readership a lot. Not just, obviously I'd like to get paid, but also because I really wrote this story because I wanted to push this story, bring more stories in. So we're not talking about 6 dudes. The country was not. The American Revolution was a social movement. It took a lot of people. It took women, it took children, it took servants, it took enslaved people, whether they wanted to or not. It took Native American people, who then changed sides or not, for good reasons. That's in the book too. But just to, it was a social movement. It took everybody, or it wouldn't have succeeded. And so I wanted to acknowledge that. I wanted to get the book out in time for the 250th birthday next year, so we can, hopefully not just talk about the same 6 people all year.
Yeah, well, I think that's a perfect place to not end, but pause the conversation for now. That brings us to the end of the event this evening. Thank you all for attending and for your thoughtful questions and just wonderful attendance. There will still be, I believe they're still selling books out in the lobby area that you passed through. So if you want to purchase the book, feel free to do so. And I think Molly will still be interested in signing things as we start to wrap things up. So one more round of applause for Molly and for Jamie this evening. Great. Thank you all.